Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 305 of Humanity Rising. Every day since the 22nd of May in 2020, as the pandemic was getting underway, we've tried to create an open space, as you all know, so people from all over the world, by the tens of thousands each and every day, can come together and share their experiences and concerns of what it's like going through this extraordinary pandemic, which still seems to be very much alive and adaptive and challenging humanity in fundamental ways. We've covered every conceivable subject. We took the month of August off, as most of you know, and we reconvened yesterday on the 1st of September. And what we have begun to contemplate is the major news of the last month, and that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change saying that the turbulence now emanating from our ecology, given global warming, is now challenging human institutions of governance and technology with the capacity to continue to maintain stability. So we are now in what the Secretary General has stated is code red for humanity. We had a very lively discussion. And today we're going to turn to perhaps the greatest philosopher in the world today, Ken Wilber, for an integral look at our world and his thinking and what he's currently writing about. But before we do that, let us take a pause, as we always do, and gather ourselves in our bodies. Take a breath and align yourself for just a minute or two with your heartbeat. See if you can listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that you're alive. And send love to every person and being and creature you can think of as you listen to your heart. Thank you, everyone. And now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you, wherever you are around the world that are tuning in to our Humanity Rising session today, I want to note that Ken Wilber is a very good friend for many, many years. He's the chancellor of Ubiquity University, which is an integral institution. Our commitment to everything that we do, all the courses that we produce, all the programs and degrees that we offer, are all offered within an integral framework, because we believe that it is only an integral approach that will enable all of us at this critical time in human history when we're confronting challenges of an unprecedented nature, to both discern the multidimensional truth of reality, but also to develop the multidimensional moral judgment leading to right action that can enable humanity to continue a journey that has begun millennia upon millennia ago, and now is challenged in ways that could mean the end of civilization as we know it. So we take very seriously an integral approach. I'm sure everyone listening knows Ken Wilber. He is the philosopher par excellence of all things integral. He's the most widely translated American philosopher in the contemporary world. He's published, I think, upwards of 30 plus books over a very long career, and I think has demonstrated a unique capacity that has led for the first time since antiquity of how human beings think about what they know. So I think Ken's singular achievement is the reinvention of human epistemology, how we know what we know. And that revolutionary movement of awareness, which he calls integral, is the singular achievement, I think, of our generation. And to the degree that we can embrace integral, we will develop a global civilization that we will be proud to bequeath to our children under the seventh generation. So I want to welcome Ken to our program today. He will look a little different than most of you have seen him in his photographs. You may want to comment on that. But Ken, welcome to Humanity Rising. And the question that I would like to start with is actually Code Red and the seeming inability and unwillingness of our national leaders to do the obvious, and that is to take seriously that there's an increasing ecological turbulence in the world today, and that they need to respond in a way that ensures that humanity can continue to inhabit this planet. But they seem unable and unwilling to do so. So I'm just wanting to start today with the most glaring and obvious fact in the world, that in the face of the challenges that beset us, right, even something as straightforward as an orderly withdrawal from Kabul, right, our leaders seem unable to get it together. From an integral perspective, how do you understand that?
Right. Well, let me say that when we talk about integral, and specifically the way I have presented integral, we're talking about a framework where the various areas of human discipline and knowledge and exploration, they all fit together. And that's one of the basic understandings that we have. And so in order to understand how I would understand things like the climate crisis and Afghan and so on, we need to know a little bit about the framework itself, because that will be the explanatory, framework that I would use to shed some understanding on the problems that we have. So I just finished a book, which I think you know about. It's called Making Room for Everything: Finding Meaning and Wholeness in the Midst of Your Life. And what it is basically an introduction and summary of the entire integral framework and approach. And so let me say that there are 5 major areas of this integral approach. All 5 of these areas have a very fundamental wholeness to them. But if you don't know about these areas, and if you don't know about these types of wholeness that you can actually attain yourself, then of course you won't even attempt to attain them. And since our society doesn't know many of these wholes, our society doesn't help its citizens attain any of these types of wholeness. And so let me just mention them, and then I'll get to dumbness of the climate response. And I think you'll see that one of these areas of wholeness particularly explains well the problems with people that don't get what the climate crisis means. So the 5 types of wholeness are waking up, growing up, cleaning up, opening up, and showing up. And so I'll just briefly walk through those 5 and give as brief an explanation as I can about each of them. And of course, we could go on, for days explaining each particular type of wholeness, because a wholeness, being a whole, has a whole lot of parts. And so it takes a little bit of work to explain them all. But waking up leads to a type of wholeness that many people have at least heard of. And it's the type of experience that people have when they get in profound wisdom tradition practices of meditation or contemplation. And all of them have an end goal, which is a staggeringly huge amount of wholeness. And this experience of having this huge wholeness is called things like enlightenment, awakening. The New Testament refers to it as metamorphosis, and it's quite emphasized on metamorphosis, just as a side issue. The Sufis call it fana. It's known as the Great Liberation, the Supreme Identity. And the general wholeness, well, it's also there are sort of common names like cosmic consciousness, ultimate unity consciousness. If you're going to talk about God, and I'll get into the problems of God, God as spirit is one thing. God as a mythological daddy in the sky type of thing. Nobody nowadays believes that type of stuff. So what you're doing with waking up is most human beings start out with a separate self. It's often called the ego or the intellectual mind. And in these great traditions of waking up, those are all sort of not good terms. Not because they're in themselves bad. So ego awareness, for example, the problem is not that we identify with our ego. The problem, according to the waking up traditions, is that we only identify with our ego. We don't realize our true self, which is one with everything. And that's how you feel when you have a waking up or satori or enlightenment experience. You feel that yourself is literally one with the entire universe, with everything that's arising. And this is often, of course, held to be the greatest good that a human being can have. And indeed, it is. So assuming that most people have at least a background understanding of what enlightenment or cosmic consciousness or ultimate unity awareness means, I'll move on to the second area of growing up. Now, what the second area shows us is something that is sometimes shocking to people, particularly people that are practicing waking up. And that's how all 5 of these areas of wholeness, although as we go through and talk about them, I think you'll see why all of them are very important, starting with waking up. But there are 5 very different types of wholeness, which might seem a little odd. You'd think that wholeness, there would just be one wholeness. And in a sense, you can think about there being one wholeness if you think about it in terms of adding up all of these 5 different wholenesses. Then you can get what I sort of somewhat goofily call a big wholeness. And to show you the difference between the difference between these wholenesses, and that also means, by the way, that you can completely get and understand and be one with the wholeness of one of these 5 wholenesses, but that won't tell you anything about the other wholenesses. So a good place to see that is to talk about waking up and then move on to the second type of wholeness, which is called growing up. And growing up is less known. It actually wasn't discovered in human beings until about 100 years ago. Whereas waking up as a direct, immediate experience has been known to humanity for at least 2,000 or 3,000 years. And if you want to go back and count the shamans, 20 or 30,000 years. But that's because a waking up experience is just that. It's a first person, immediate experience. When you know, if you're sitting in meditation and all of a sudden you become one with the world in bliss and love, you know it. It's completely obvious. It's a first person, direct, immediate experience. The problem with growing up, and the reason that it was only discovered about 100 years ago, is it's more a third person type of grammar or subconscious map that human beings, we all have a series of these grammar maps in us. And I'll come back to what they are and try to explain it a little more, because that's the somewhat less known aspect of growing up that people sometimes have a little bit harder a time understanding. But growing up, what we found, and the reason it took a long time, like I say, only about 100 years ago that growing up was even discovered. That means that all the earlier philosophies and all of the earlier religions know nothing about this type of wholeness, but it's incredibly important. And that is, take a newborn who's a few months old. Can that newborn perform brain surgery or play the piano or speak 2 or 3 different languages? Not likely. What happens is that we're born with a set of potential maps or potential grammars that will develop, and we actually grow through them. And they've been given many, many different names because, as we'll see, there are actually multiple intelligences that move through all of these levels of development. And so we have a lot of different ways that we can grow and develop. So one simple one that I like to use is the names to these stages of development that were given to them by a developmental genius named Gene Gebser. And he called these stages, remember, these are the stages in your own awareness that everybody goes through. So they start out at what he called the archaic stage. Then we grow to the magic stage, then the mythic stage, then the rational stage, then the pluralistic or relativistic stage, and then his highest stage is an integral stage, which pulls them all together. But these different approaches, they can be, some models have fewer stages, some have more stages. The average model has about 6 to 8 stages, but you can summarize them as 4 broad stages as long as they're covering the actual territory that we go through when we grow. So magic corresponds also with this general stage of development called egocentric. And that's where the young child looks at the world as an extension of itself. And to be magic means that you can simply think something and that will change it. That will magically change it. So like if you have a voodoo doll and you want to get something bad to happen to that person out there, then you make this voodoo doll look like that person. So the voodoo doll is a thought representation that represents that other person. And if you take a pin and stick it in the doll, that other person will magically get sick. That's magic. So when we all go through a magic stage, it's called word magic. And all parents with any infants will remember the magic stage just as they watch their child interact. And by the way, as the magic stage gets a little bit older, one of his favorite things to watch is Saturday cartoons of superheroes, because what marks a superhero? Superhero. A superhero can always do magic. They can walk through walls, they can fly, they have X-ray vision, they can zap people. And kids at the magic stage just eat that up because that's the way they actually feel. Well, that magic will sometimes, well, at some point, it'll start to die down and be replaced by mythic. Now, at the mythic stage, the child has realized it can no longer actually perform magic. It's growing up and growing out of that magic stage. But the magic doesn't just disappear, it's put in supernatural figures, mythological figures. And these mythic gods and goddesses and supernatural elements, they can perform magic. And if you approach one of those deity forms or god forms or goddess forms, and you do it with supplication or prayer or the right type of attitude, then you can convince that God to do magic on your behalf. And that's what people like about that stage of development. That stage of development, that mythic stage, by the way, in humanity's history, when we as a whole were going through the mythic stage, that's the stage where the first great civilizations were created, but also all of the original great religious traditions were written at that point in time. That's why the Bible is full of magic and mythic figures. So I have to move quickly. So anyway, that's magic to mythic. And mythic is called ethnocentric. Magic is egocentric because I think I can do it. Each individual thinks they can do magic themselves. But when they can't, they transfer that magic to a mythic figure and it can do magic for them. Again, as long as they're praying doing prayer correctly or doing sacrifices correctly. This is where sacrifice became a storm, and including in some cases human sacrifice. You're doing that to get your God to give you something magically. So that's another major stage. Then as we start to grow out of that, we start to move into the rational levels. And whereas magic has a first person perspective, and ethnocentric mythic has a second person perspective, rationality develops a third person perspective. Each of these increases are, of course, evolution at work in us, driving us to greater levels of complexity and unity and cognitive sophistication and so on. The rational level didn't start to emerge until what we refer to as the Western Enlightenment. And this was only a couple hundred years ago. So it was at that stage with rationality and its third person perspective that virtually all of the modern sciences were invented. We didn't have modern science until 1600 at the earliest, 1700 mostly developing. And these were profound increases in human evolution. It also brought an increase in moral development. And as we'll see when we talk about our next type of wholeness, which is called opening up and refers to all the multiple intellects that we actually have. One of those is moral intelligence. And all of these intelligences grow through the same levels of development. So when you're at magic, you had all 12 multiple intelligences, but they were all operating magically. When you get to mythic, you still have all 12 or so moral intelligences, but they're all operating at mythic and ethnocentric stages of development. And ethnocentric means that your identity has expanded from being, you're just identified with your own organism, that's in the egocentric magic stage, to ethnocentric, which taking on a second person perspective means that your identity can expand to second people, the second persons, which means an entire group. And so you get group forms at ethnocentric stages, and that move up is a good because it expands the degree of love and care that you yourself can extend to the world instead of just being egocentrically caring about yourself. So as you get at that ethnocentric stage, it's also called ethnocentric, not just because it means a group awareness, but it also is referring to, when we say ethnocentric today, we usually have some fairly unpleasant meanings in mind, like you're homophobic, you're racist, you're sexist, you're xenophobic, you're misogynistic, something like that. And that's because the group mentality that develops at the mythic ethnocentric stage can only, it has a very us versus them attitude. And if you're not part of us and you're part of them, then that is the basis of a prejudice, if you see what I mean.
Sure.
So when rationality, and so things like slavery are absolutely fine at the ethnocentric mythic stages. That's why virtually every culture the world over had slavery. Even the original egocentric magic tribes, about 15% of them had slaves. And one of the reasons is that they didn't run into each other very often. And so when they did, they often got into warfare or they would take slaves. So that became a real problem. So we still had, there were, in terms of some of the great civilizations, up to 90% of them had slaves. And that was, to put it mildly, not good. But nobody objected to it. None of the great religions, which we also saw came into existence during this general mythic period, none of them objected to slavery. Thomas Sowell's History of Slavery says, quote, Christian monasteries had slaves, Buddhist monasteries had slaves, virtually all of them had slaves. St. Paul recommends to slaves, obey your master and love Jesus Christ. That's it. He doesn't say, oh, fight for your freedom or try to get out of it. They didn't have any objections to it. The large culture that was in charge of it. Well, once we get to the rational level, the moral intelligence also gets at the rational level. And where the magic stage is egocentric and the mythic stage is ethnocentric, the rational stage is world-centric. And that means it can identify with all human beings, not just one group. And so when that happened, almost as soon as that happened, while they were discovering all the new modern sciences and all of that, because a large number of people had their own moral sensibility moved to a world-centric stage. So it was no longer ethnocentric and slavery's fine. At the world-centric stage, human rights extend to all humans everywhere, simply because you're born human, not because you're born a Catholic or born a German or born a Frenchman, and as that member of that special group, you have special rights. It's all people all over the world had rights. And so that, as you can see, that world-centric is a continuing growth in wholeness. It's a continued movement of evolution to embody larger and larger, more complex structures of existence. So we're seeing a egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric growth. And all of these stages can be subdivided into several stages. The only major stage that I almost always subdivide is the world-centric, because there were two major levels of the world-centric. One was rational, and then in just the 1960s, and that rational stage again started around 1600, 1700. So that's why, I mean, think about it. We only got rid of slavery about 200 years ago. In a 100-year period from 1770 to 1870, every rational industrial country on the face of the planet got rid of slaves. First time anything like that has ever happened. So that's why. And it's a very slow development, but it does tend to pick up and get a little speedier as we move on. But by 1960s, a new stage of development started to emerge in the leading edge of cultural evolution. And that was referred to, sometimes I call it the postmodern stage, because that's what it was dealing with. Maslow called it the relativistic stage, because what happens with the pluralistic or relativistic stage is that because it adds a fourth person perspective, it can reflect on the universal rational systems that the previous stage that had a third person perspective, because it can reflect on, postmodern can reflect on the modern stage, it started to become very critical of it. And this is what the postmodern philosophers did, whether it's, you think of Foucault or Derrida or Lyotard, they were all hypercritical of modernity, whereas modernity was almost always love and progress and everything is good and aren't we doing fantastic? And for a matter of fact, we did for several hundred years, creating all the sciences and all the technologies to go with that and so on. But by the time we get to the 1960s and the postmodern phase, there's a profound sort of shift. And in particular, postmodernity is unrelentingly negative. It's worried enormously about what's going on in a world-centric perspective. In other words, it's world-centric too, just like rationality is, but where rationality looked at the world through a world-centric lens, all it could see is the application of various forms of science. So for example, with rational modernity, there wasn't such a thing as Hindu science and Buddhist science and Jewish science. There was just science, and it was true universally. So again, you didn't have Hindu chemistry and Jewish chemistry and Buddhist chemistry and Taoist chemistry. You just had chemistry, period. And it was the same everywhere. Well, that's what postmodernity looked at. And they got very annoyed with the rankings that modernity would come up with in terms of, well, this culture understood this much science and this culture understood this much science, and this culture didn't understand any science at all, so it sucked. And the postmodernists got extremely annoyed with that type of attitude and that type of approach. So they became unrelentingly negative in their philosophy. And if you think of any great postmodern philosopher today, he or she has written a series of books that are unrelentingly critical and negative. Particularly all of Western civilization. Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western civ has got to go. And it just became a complete change up in attitude. And when that happened, that's when the culture wars developed. The culture wars are wars between three different value systems. The postmodern value systems, which are things like multiculturalism, diversity, inclusion, identity politics, and so on. It was those set of values versus modern values, which were all positive, truth, meritocracy, and individual rights. And that was the second set of values. And then the third set of values were what had by this time become known as the religious values. They were actually founded mostly at the mythic stage, although it does get a little complicated, the religious picture, because a very small percentage of religious approaches do have paths of waking up. So even in Christianity, where on the early centuries of Christianity's growth, what they would have is these councils, and they'd come up with creeds like the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed. And these were creeds of nothing but mythic beliefs. So they'd say, I believe in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. I believe that the Son is the one and only begotten Son of the Creator, Father, God. I believe the Son was dead and resurrected in 3 days. He was born of a Virgin Mary. All of those are myths. They're of the same nature as Zeus or Apollo or Aphrodite or any of those, except in some places, these mythic figures really took hold. And so Jesus Christ is an example of that. And like all of these superheroes, they can do magic, an enormous amount of magic. So Jesus can walk on water, turn water into wine, multiply the loaves of bread, heal the sick, raise the dead, fly through the air. He can read minds. I mean, that's a pretty, if you took that guy and put him on a Saturday morning cartoon show with the rest of the superheroes, he would be a killer. So those religious values versus the modern scientific rational values versus the postmodern relativistic, truth uncertain. As a matter of fact, it maintains that there is no truth, that objective truth is just a white man, white supremacist way to gain control over the world and stuff like that. Now, there are some positive things that postmodernism does by reflecting on all of the universal systems that rational modernity had built. It reflected and did give some good criticisms of them. And it came up with constructivism, contextualism, and aperspectivism. And these are all pretty good philosophical accoutrements for that era. But those three value systems went into warfare when the postmodern stage emerged and started to get down on top of everybody. The only problem with the postmodern stage is it can differentiate. Every growth in development differentiates and integrates, differentiates and integrates. And you see this throughout evolution. If you watch a zygote forming, it'll start out as one cell. Those will divide into 4 cells. Those will divide into 8 cells. Those will divide into 16 cells. That's a differentiation. And as that keeps going, they'll start integrating, the different cells will start integrating into actual systems, digestive system, muscular system, neuronal system, and so on. So differentiate and integrate is a very important part of what's going on as we see this upward evolutionary growth into increasing wholeness. And well, I'm thinking several ways to go. So what I was originally talking about is the problem with the pluralistic relativistic level is that while it can differentiate all of these previous universal systems that the modern West came up with, like there's not Jewish chemistry versus Hindu chemistry versus German chemistry, there's just chemistry. Well, when postmodernity looked at all of those sort of rigid but universal and world-centric, including all human beings, they could differentiate those systems, but they couldn't yet integrate them. They didn't have enough cognitive power to integrate all those differentiations. So they look at all the cultures and differentiate them, but because they didn't know how to build them together into evolutionary holarchies or evolutionary hierarchies, they just came up with a resort sort of position, which was, well, we have to treat all of them the same. None of them are more valuable than the others. And that gave rise to the main value that the pluralistic or relativistic stage has, which is called egalitarianism. And that means nothing or nobody or no value is better or worse than another. So if postmodernism doesn't see everybody being treated exactly the same according to an equal outcome, then they claim oppression. So wherever they see a differentiation of groups and one group is at all doing slightly better than another group, that's due only to oppression. So when the modern structure tended to divide people, if they were going to divide it, they would divide it into winners and losers. Winners were the ones higher with more intelligence, perhaps more capable of engaging in science, higher on meritocracy. And that would be one of the main divisions that they would make between winners and losers. The main developmental differentiation that the postmodern stage made was not winners and losers, but oppressors and victims. Because again, that's what they're looking at. If everybody isn't doing exactly the same, it's due only to oppression. And therefore, the only two types of humans there are in the world are oppressors and victims. So in the modern era, the only person that would be rewarded was a winner. In the postmodern era, the only person that's rewarded is a victim. So victimhood becomes sort of sacrosanct in that developmental understanding. The major jump is from pluralistic to integral. And this is a jump that has never occurred anywhere before, essentially, in human history. And it marks a stunning advance. Claire Graves, the great developmental genius, called the leap from all of these first structures they called first tier, because all first tier structures think that their truth and values are the only real truth and values in the world. And so there's always tension between every first tier structure, whether it was magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic. None of them got along that well, which is one reason that historically, for every 1 year of peace, there have been 13 years of war in humanity's history. A large part of that is just a first tier melee. And even people at the higher stages feel that way. But what happens with second tier is they're the first structures that, because they're so integrated, because they're so highly evolved, because they can grasp wholeness better than any previous structure, first tier stages all understand that all of the first tier stages are necessary. You need them all. You can't say, oh, one is rotten and throw it out. And they're all important because if nothing else, they're all stages in a total human development. And so of course you need them all. And you can't skip a stage. Like you can go from atoms to molecules to cells to organisms. That's another holistic growth sequence that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You can't go from atoms to cells and skip molecules. It just won't work. Can't be done. Well, second tier has that understanding about all of the preceding stages of development. So among other things, it can actually accomplish the values that green starts to hold in its mind, that is, say, postmodernism starts to hold in its mind, but can't quite achieve because they deny the existence of any hierarchies. So they don't see the difference between dominator hierarchies, which are all the bad things they say they are, and growth hierarchies. Growth hierarchies are atoms to molecules to cells to organisms, and then organisms up an increasingly complex tree of life. Growth holarchy is egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to integral. Each of those stages envelop the previous ones. They transcend and include them. They differentiate and integrate them. So when we get to integral, and Claire Graves called the shift from second tier to first tier, where we get these integral stages, he called it cataclysmic and a monumental leap of meaning. And that's exactly what it was. And Claire Graves didn't speak like that often. He was not an exaggerating, exuberant type. So that's a little bit of growing up, and you can see that it leads to an extraordinary wholeness. But because none of these structures can be seen by introspecting, we can't look within and see the stages. Oh, that's a magic stage. That's a mythic stage. Oh, now I'm operating from Meshna. Because they can't be seen by introspecting, that's why they weren't discovered until around 100 years ago. So we started out on growing up by talking about how understanding the wholeness of one of the 5 types won't give you the wholeness of any of the others. So take as a good example, waking up to growing up. Waking up is clearly a huge wholeness. It's a one with the entire universe. But it can't see any of the stages of growing up. I mean, I can even give a simpler example. We said that experiences of waking up have been going back at least several thousand years. So imagine that you're like a practitioner that's working to get a waking up or a satori. You're a Zen student, and you're working on getting your first awakening, your first enlightenment experience, your first satori, and you take a walk through the woods, and the sun is shining over your head, and the earth is flat under your feet. You can feel it, and you're seeing all the trees go by, and all of a sudden, pow, you have an extraordinary waking up experience. You have a satori, you have an enlightenment right on the spot. And then all of a sudden, you're one with the sun. You no longer feel any difference from it. You're one with the earth. You're no longer any difference from it. You're not walking on the earth, you are the earth. You're not seeing the sun, you are the sun. So that's big. But notice that you'll still think the sun goes around the earth, and you'll still think the earth is flat. And that won't change. You'll just be one with them. But you're not getting any specific information from waking up. And in part, the reason is that when you wake up, you're said to be coming one with the ground of all being. And I think that's correct. But notice there's only one ground of all being. This side of the earth doesn't have a different infinite ground of all being on the other side of the earth. And the earth doesn't have a different ground of being than Jupiter, or a frog doesn't have a different ground of being than a tree. So because you are aware of this ground, you'll be one with all of those. But that's it. that oneness won't tell you anything about an individual thing because it's the same oneness under all of them. So getting in touch with that oneness under all of them won't tell you anything about the many. That's why even those cultures that had waking up still had slavery. It's not telling you anything about the individuals. So you by all means want to do waking up because that gives you an ultimate absolute ground of being. But you want to add growing up because you can be at the ethnocentric stage of growing up, the mythic ethnocentric stage. You can have a wonderful satori and be one with everything and still not object to slavery because you won't have any information about that individual thing that you call a slave. And that's why virtually all of the traditions that first discovered waking up had slavery. So you don't want to just do a waking up practice, although you clearly want to do a waking up practice, but just doing that and getting that wholeness won't tell you anything about the wholeness of growing up. So that's important to remember. And it's true for all 5 of the ones we're going through. And I see we're running out a little bit of time here, so I'll try and speed this up a little bit. I hope this hasn't been too speedy so far. So we have waking up and we have growing up. And these growing up structures go through stages of development. And I said on average, there's about, if you look at all the different models of growing up there are about 6 to 8 on average levels that are given for the overall spectrum of growing up. And by the way, I did a book called Integral Psychology, where I examined over 100 different developmental models, East and West, North and South, early, Middle Ages, modern, postmodern. And I listed all 100 of them in charts. You can look at it if you want to see. And each of them had the names of the levels of the stages that they gave. And the two things became really apparent. One is that the same rough 6 to 8 stages, although with numerous different names, showed up. But the other was, although many of these models some of them had 20 stages, some of them had 4 stages, but you could see that on average, most of them are covering 6 to 8 stages of growth and development. And all 6 to 8 stages of those are important for us to understand, so we'll know where we're coming from, not only in the culture wars, but just where are we towards a full wholeness of all that we can be. So Ubiquity University, for example, stresses an integral wholeness. And they want to, wherever you start is fine, they want to help to get you up to this integral wholeness. Each of those 6 to 8 levels of development have upwards of a dozen different lines of development. And what a line means is simply an independent quality or skill, and it'll grow, it has to grow through the same levels that are available. But because they're independent lines, one of the lines can go this far, another line might go that far, another line might go that far, another line might stay down here. You might have no development in another line. In another line, you might have a super development. You get the point? It's different lines going through the same levels. And the same levels are the levels I just went over. And so you can understand when I go through what these multiple intelligences are. So for example, if I mention moral intelligence, you can realize that that's going to start at an egocentric stage where the child thinks it's what's right, is whatever they want. They'll steal food, they'll take it, they'll all sorts of stuff. That's an egocentric moral stance. And some adults, we all know some adults that maybe are still a little bit stuck in that stage. Ethnocentric moral development tends to be things like my country, right or wrong. It's often called a conformity stage because you've expanded up to being able to integrate or, well, integrate in a certain sense, interact with a whole lot of other people because now you're identified with a group. And the difficulty in that group is how do you get along with other individual souls or roles in that group. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to simply go along with what everybody else is doing. That's why one of the most common forms of these ethnocentric stages is called conformity. It's also called conventional mythic membership, because remember, it's at the mythic stage and you want to get a membership in its fundamental myths. And so that's an important part of, well, mixing multiple intelligences and understanding how each of them develops through the different levels that we've laid out. So again, same levels, different lines. Now I'm going to briefly read you a list of some of the multiple intelligences that we all have. And you'll recognize the adjective. So if I say moral intelligence, you'll recognize the term moral, what this intelligence is about. Or if I say mathematical intelligence, you'll understand what mathematical intelligence is about. But when it comes to moral or social or motivational intelligence, you might understand those words, but you don't know what those intelligences mean. And to the extent that you don't know what they mean, you're missing out on another type of intelligence that if you just spent a few minutes a day for just a week or two, you'd be able to resurrect that intelligence that you didn't know you had. So this is aiming towards a wholeness of increased intelligence. And as I read them, I think you'll see that some of them are pretty important. So, and let me first say that these multiple intelligences are not generally recognized by our culture, nor by our educational systems. The only two intelligences that are tested for on the SAT test, for example, are cognitive intelligence and verbal intelligence. And those are the only two. So that's not good. And because they don't know these other intelligences are there, they don't even think about trying to educate them in you, or just to show that you have them, or even take a day off once a week and call it multiple intelligence day, and then have them actually act out what this intelligence means so that they can start to understand it in themselves. So this isn't even a complete list. This is about 13 or so multiple intelligences that we all have. Cognitive intelligence, emotional intelligence, that has to do with feelings, moral intelligence, of course, ethical, social intelligence is interpersonal, mathematical intelligence, verbal intelligence, motivational intelligence, like Maslow's needs hierarchy, kinesthetic intelligence, or what your body is knowing, spiritual intelligence. And this is different from a direct spiritual experience that you have in waking up. This is a multiple intelligence. So with waking up, as I said, it's a direct first person experience that you directly know about. But spiritual intelligence is how you think about spirit, or whether you think about what is ultimate reality or what is infinity or something like that. And so those are two different types of intelligence. So it is how you think about the absolute, or how you think about, anytime you're thinking about an ultimate concern, which is a term that's often used for spirit in more modern intellectual types. An ultimate concern basically means what's the most important of the most important thing in your life. And that would be, in using old terms, that would be your God. That would be your spirit. That would be what you take to be ultimately important. So if you think you don't have an ultimate concern or a God figure, simply make a list of the most important things in your life. And top of that list is your ultimate concern. So the top of that list is your God, so to speak. Now, I'm not going to use the word God too often because it's particularly associated with the mythic ethnocentric stage. And what we're trying to do is we recognize that because there's a spiritual intelligence, that's a multiple line or multiple intelligence. And it starts at the lowest level, and like all the other lines, it'll move all the way through the other levels of development as far as it can go until it stops. But spiritual intelligence can go quite high. Certainly it can go higher than the ethnocentric stage. So we have people at the rational stage thinking about what's infinity, what's ultimate reality, what's the most important thing I can think of. They're using spiritual intelligence at a rational level, and they come up with rational statements about it. You can take somebody like Bishop Shelby Spong, who's a brilliant writer out of the Episcopalian tradition. And he's written a recent book. He's written a dozen or more books. I recommend all of them. His recent one is called Unbelievable. And what he's doing is he's given a completely rational reinterpretation of the Bible. And whenever he gets to a supernatural or a magic or a mythical portion of the Bible, he just bypasses that. He just doesn't count that. And why? He says, because to a modern educated person, all of those ideas are unbelievable. So they're all myths, like Moses parted the Red Sea, or when Elijah died, he went straight to heaven in his chariot. Jesus Christ was born of an actual biological virgin. Spong believes none of those myths. They're all unbelievable. So because his spiritual intelligence has continued to move on, he's moving into rational and even pluralistic stages of development. Thomas Jefferson, incidentally, for those who know a fair amount about Thomas Jefferson, this is a fairly well-known story, but most people haven't heard of it, and it's actually fairly hilarious. Thomas Jefferson, being a particularly strong exponent of the Enlightenment, which remember was particularly when the rational world-centric stage came into existence. He was so furious with the Bible and all of its myths and magic and miracles that there's an apocryphal image of him sitting on the stages of the White House with a Bible in one hand and a pair of scissors in the other. And he's actually going through and cutting out, literally cutting out all of the magic and mythic junk from the Bible. And so he just leaves the rational and moral parts of the Bible. And this Bible was actually published. It was called the Jefferson Bible. So that's a spiritual intelligence that continues to evolve. Okay, so.
Ken, quick question.
Yeah.
In terms of these lines of multiple intelligences, what differentiation would you make between men and women?
Well, there's a very long discussion. First of all, because we're going to get into the whole non-binary transgender discussion if we talk about the difference between men and women, let me say that when we get to the quadrants, because a wholeness that involves the quadrants is called showing up. And that means it's important to show up for all four quadrants, because what the quadrants are fundamental dimensions and perspectives that all human beings have. And so if you look in the upper right, well, they're divided into individual and collective. So, and inside and outside. And if you draw those, you'll get four boxes: inside of the subjective, inside of the collective, outside of the individual, and outside of the collective. And science, when it first was invented, was essentially a study of the exteriors of the objective. And it would do it in individual forms, which are generally forms of atomism. It would also study the exterior objective form of collectives, and that was systems theory. So in the upper right, we have typical orthodox science. And if you draw a line of the various holons that go up that line, you'll find it moving from atoms to molecules to cells to organisms, up to various plants, up to various fish, amphibian, reptiles, mammals, and humans. And in the human being, because each stage transcends and includes the previous one, you'll find it has a reptilian brain stem, a mammalian limbic system, and a primate neocortex. And each of those are transcending and including the lesser one, but they'll each be present. That's what it looks like in the upper right. The study of that is known as empirical science, and it's generally taken to be the most accurate form of truth that humans can get at. Now, there are geniuses in all four quadrants, and so we'll find different types of studies occurring in all of four quadrants. So the upper right is typical empirical science, the study of the science of an individual thing. If you go to the lower right, you find collective, the studies of the objective studies of the exterior of a collective. In other words, systems theory. And systems theory in particular also works with artifacts. An artifact is an insentient holon that's produced by a living sentient holon. So a bird's nest, beaver's dam, a lion's den, things like that. Human beings excel in artifacts, and they also evolve to greater and greater forms. So Lenski discovered a widely accepted holarchy of techno-economic artifacts. They run from foraging to horticultural to agrarian to industrial to informational. And that's right. And so we can study, there are fields that study all of those in the lower right. In the upper left, the individual and the end studied from a subjective point of view, not the individual studied from an objective point of view, which is the upper right, typical science. But there were, from the beginning, geniuses that said, wait a minute, we have something to learn by studying our subjective mind itself. And of course, many schools of philosophy, subjective idealism and so on, would maintain that only that quadrant has reality. But it certainly includes things like psychoanalysis, various aspects of psychology, phenomenology is what it's particularly known as. We discovered a technique called developmental psychology, which is a way to finally study those structures of our mind. Well, those are all studies of the upper left quadrant. And then, of course, it includes everything that an individual is thinking or producing in their own mind at any given time. Then the lower left is just as the upper right, if you take groups of individuals in upper right, you get the lower right. Same if you take groups of individual subjective minds in the upper left and put them together, you get culture, or the intersubjective gathering together of individual minds. So everything from language to shared values, to shared morals, group habits or habitas, all of those are part of the lower left, the culture. And I must say, I'm delighted to see that the importance of culture is starting to finally get some attention. So like if somebody thinks of a paradigm as a different way of thinking about something, then a paradigm comes from the lower left. And also cultural likes and dislikes, and all of those items emerge through the interaction of individual minds. So if you look at sex or gender, what do you find? Well, the two arguments, the great arguments, are gender is fluid and non-binary, and there can be 100 different genders. Whereas the science, the upper right quadrant, maintains no. When you look at a biological body, all of the higher animals we're aware of have the equivalent of an X or a Y. And an XY is a boy and an XX is a girl. And except for these very few actual physical mixtures of these two called intersex, that's it. There are two sexes in the real world. And anybody who denies that reality is delusional in a clinical sense. They're denying the utter reality that's right in front of them. But now if we go to the upper left, reality up there includes your own wishes, your own desires, your own thoughts. The same is true of culture. culture can define what it wants to in almost any number of ways. And over the centuries and decades and years, it has done exactly that. So when you move from the right-hand quadrants, which are essentially both objective orthodox science, science of individual in the upper right and the science of collective systems theory in the lower right, if you move from that upper right to the left-hand quadrants, you get an entirely different story. If you, in your upper left, on the interior of your own subjective being, if you say, I feel like I'm a woman today, then that's what you are. That's fine. We have no objections to that type of wish, if that's the way you actually feel. And by the way, culture can then catch on and agree with that or disagree. It looks like it's increasingly starting to come around. The culture wars are sort of winning in that department. And so if you say, man cannot become a woman, then you're canceled. The woke culture will come and get you. And so, and the woke culture is nasty when it cancels. It says that Germaine Greer, because she says a woman can't be a man, then she's no longer a real feminist. So they tossed her out of the feminist club. Kanye West came along and said something nice about Trump. And so he was thrown out of being Black. They actually had national Black magazines writing, Kanye West is no longer Black. The same with gay. We had somebody say that, it's Peter Thiel, announced that he was for Trump. And the very next day, the largest national gay magazine in the world wrote, quote, Peter Thiel may sleep with men, but he's no longer gay. So this is the kind of battle we get if you don't take an integral view. I'm in favor of all of them. But what I'm not in favor of is when one side denies the existence of the other side and tries to cancel it or deprogram it or throw it off, deplatform it. That's just ridiculous. Of course, you can claim that a man can become a woman according to the left-hand side of things. But if that woman herself went in a biology lab and started studying sex in biology, she would find that there are two and only two sexes. And if she's going to be true to the science, she's going to have to admit that. It won't stop her from, as soon as she steps out of the lab, being a woman. Or she can still be a woman in the lab too. I'm just saying she's going to find out what scientific truth means. The problem with the culture wars is that, particularly in the far left side of it, they're getting so bad, they're starting to deny the existence of quadrants. They're particularly denying the existence of science. And this is so weird because the Democrats used to be known for their belief in science. Now they're the first ones to absolutely tear it down and deny any reality to it. So that is not good. Is that?
Yeah. No, thank you for that. That's quite illuminating. But
Okay.
let's finish up the different forms. You got to wake up and growing up. We still have clearing up, opening up, and showing up.
Right. Now, if you look in the various lines of multiple intelligences that are growing up through the various levels they have available to them, you'll find that one of them that I didn't mention because it takes a little explaining is what you could call the defense line or the line of defense mechanisms. These are mechanisms that, in an attempt to ward off what's perceived to be a big problem, they will repress or disown or dissociate aspects of your own psyche, aspects of your entire body mind. And those split off aspects are often called shadow. And the shadow can come in negative forms. So if I have a degree of anger, for example, and I can no longer accept that in myself, and I start projecting it onto other people, then I'll feel other people are angry at me. And I don't know what I've done wrong because I don't have any anger. No, you don't have any anger. You just threw yours out and projected it onto somebody else. So those are negative forms of shadow. And there are positive ones, which are generally called the golden shadow. You can repress and lose track of and disown your good qualities, your virtue, your moral character, your beauty. Any of these can be projected as well. And when you project positives onto other people, then those other people tend to be perceived in very heroic terms. Oh, that's the best person I've ever met. They're the most moral person I've ever met. Romantic love, and I don't mean love in general, but just the romantic part of love, is often the two partners projecting their golden shadows onto each other. And then the guy feels, oh, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, and slobber, slobber, slobber. And the woman feels, oh, you're the strongest man I've ever met. Oh, slobber, slobber. And they stay at that, can be for up to a year or so. And then the trick is how to fall out of that and how to integrate your shadow in a decent way. And handling all of those aspects is what we call cleaning up. So cleaning up is handling shadow material. And I don't have to say too much about this. Although there were a lot of forerunners, it's generally ascribed in the modern West to Sigmund Freud and his inner circle. And this inner circle of Freud's, by the way, were all bona fide geniuses. They consisted of Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, Otto Rank, and Ferenczi. And every one of these, I'm sure most of those names you've heard of, but they were truly brilliant. The only problem with Freud, and this is what caused the split between Freud and Jung, is Freud really ended up reductionistically reducing all of the unconscious to just the id. And the id was, in a sense, your negative shadow. It was the it, third person monster inside of you. Freud, by the way, most people know the term ego and id from Freud, but Freud himself never, ever used either one of those terms. What he was talking about was first person, which is defined as the person who's speaking. Second person, so it's I, me, mine. Second person is the person being spoken to, so that's you or thou or all of you. And then third person is the person or thing being spoken about. So that's he, him, they, them, or since third person is referring to persons or things, then the two common pronouns for third person are it and its. Now, we'll come back to those briefly when we talk about showing up. But for Freud never used the ego, which was a first person I, or the id, which was Latin for it. Those terms, ego and id, were added to Freud's work by his official translator, James Strachey. And Strachey added those terms because he thought they would make Freud sound more scientific. The more Latin was thrown in, the more scientific it was. And so that's how those words got thrown in there. The words Freud used were the actual original pronouns in German for each of those. So he would say, he wouldn't say the ego can be impacted badly by the id. He would actually write, the I can be badly impacted by the it. And that's just a perfect phenomenological description of what happens when you repress something. You push it out of consciousness, and then it appears as a symptom, as a neurosis, as a problem. So when Freud was asked, what is it that psychoanalysis does? Freud gave perhaps his most famous statement ever. He said, where id was, their ego shall be. Except that's not what he really said. He said, where it was, their I shall be. And that's exactly what psychoanalysis does. It takes all of those its, all of those ids, all of those shadows that you've sealed off, denied are yours, don't want anything to do with, and you push them out of yourself and you repress them. And when you do that, you usually push them on to somebody else who you then see has all of your shadow material. Now, often the person you'll choose to project something onto is a person that does indeed have some of your shadow material. And so they become a good hook for you to project your own stuff onto. So if there's a very angry person around you, that would be a good person for you to select for having your anger, because it just makes sense. But then this person has a double dose of anger, and it's directed at you. And so you'll probably feel, when you do that, you'll feel fear or anxiety, and you don't know why. Normally, if somebody was getting mad at you, you might just get mad back at them. But you can't do that now because you projected all your anger onto them. And they've got all of their anger plus your anger, and all of that's aimed at you. And it's that double dose of anger that causes you to feel fear and anxiety and basically crazy. So perhaps just from that quick example, you can see that cleaning up is an important aspect for us to keep in mind, because we won't get it from opening up. We won't get it from growing up. We very rarely will get any of it from waking up either. As a matter of fact, waking up practices have been shown in some cases to make shadow material worse. So I'll just sort of leave it with cleaning up is an important area for increasing wholeness, because the wholeness that we're increasing is we have our whole psyche, then we split off portions of it and project them out, and then our psyche becomes smaller. And the more we project material, the smaller it becomes. And this becomes important even in growing up, because as you grow up, you're adding new material to yourself. It's getting bigger and bigger on the way to a real wholeness. And as that new material comes up, if you can't assimilate it in yourself, if you can't accept it as part of yourself, then you'll split it off. And so this is a real problem at every stage of growing up. And when you engage in cleaning up and learn to take back the material that you projected, your psyche gets bigger. It goes back towards a whole and healthy psyche that you want to have. So that's clearly a very important form of wholeness, especially since it's present in all people. Okay, now I'll last to showing up, and I realize I'm way behind time.
No, we still need to do opening up. You just did clearing up and then now opening up.
Opening up was simply opening to all of your multiple intelligences.
Gotcha.
As I said, most people, they hear these and they realize, oh, I didn't know I had that kind of intelligence. I didn't know I had that kind of intelligence. Some people really, because they're educated in just cognitive and verbal intelligence, that's all they think they have. Where they've got at least a dozen other types of thinking, types of intelligence that they can engage in. Emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, social intelligence, kinesthetic intelligence, spiritual intelligence, and so on. And so opening up to all of that gives us a much greater wholeness in our capacity for intelligent awareness and just our capacity of understanding the types of skills that we have. So thank you for that reminder, but is that clear?
Yeah.
That's
so now showing up. Showing up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So showing up is, we talked a little bit about the 4 quadrants. Now, the 4 quadrants are not just areas that I made up. They really are underlining an enormous number of other frameworks that have been used to deal with reality. And let me discuss briefly, since the 2 right-hand quadrants are science, individual science and system science. Now, the fact is, individual science and system science don't get along very good. So they really are coming from different quadrants. But sometimes, if you count them together as one, then we have 3 quadrants: the upper left and the upper left and the lower left. Those remain; they're always separate. And you can see that, and there's not much argument about that. But individual science and systems theory have always been a bit at odds, because the people that want a purely reductionistic science don't want to include wholes, actual wholes, WHOLES, in their science. So they look at a wheel and all they see, the atomists, the individualists, all they see are separate spokes in the separate wheel. And since they have to think the same way about that, when they look at the separate spokes, all they see are the smallest particles in the separate spokes. So we can reduce a wheel down to its separate parts, including its different spokes. And then we have to reduce all of that down to the smallest atomic part that we can get. Some of these atomic parts do come together. So atoms do come together to form molecules, molecules form cells, cells form organisms. And each one of those taken by itself is considered an individual reality. So it's part of the upper right. And if you're going to be a serious scientific reductionist, that's what you're going to do. But systems theorists say, no, what's real are the wholes. And the only thing apart is an abstraction from the whole. So it doesn't really count. It's not really real. And so individual science won't have anything to do with wholes, holistic systems theory science. I think the difference is as clear as night and day. That's why I always count them as two separate quadrants. But just so you know, I'll mention when we reduce 4 quadrants to just 3, we'll often call them the big 3, because there's still the same importance of having the quadrants, but we're talking about 3 of them instead of 4 of them. The most typical example of 4 quadrants showing up universally in just 3 dimensions is the personal pronouns that I mentioned. Every major language around the world universally recognizes first person, second person, and third person pronouns. So first person, again, is the person speaking. Second person is the person spoken to. And third person is the person or thing being spoken about. Now, it might seem that all 3 of those are important, and they are. And the whole point in showing up is you want to show up for all of them. You want to include all of them, not only in your own awareness, but in your own thinking. And certainly if you do theoretical work, and I'll give an example of why this is so important. Most people take first person consciousness and just use the term first person, and that means a study of consciousness for them in toto, in general. And that's one branch of the official school of consciousness studies. But the other branch is just the opposite, and they're called third person approaches. And they think consciousness is nothing but the result of interactions at the atomic level of brain neurophysiology. And they think first person is just an epiphenomena or something that comes drug in through the back door. It doesn't have any reality itself, and it doesn't have any impact on your brain. So there's no free will, which is a primary belief of upper left. There's strict determinism, and your brain and nervous system is what creates consciousness. And that's the end of that discussion. Well, you can see that I think you can understand how both of those approaches have a degree of reality to them. I mean, where every week some researcher is coming up with some correlation between a brain state and a mind state. So they'll get people in a lab in an angry mood, then they'll take a scan of their brain and they'll say, anger comes from the amygdala in the hypothalamus. And that's all it is. When that area lights up, person's going to feel anger. And they let it go at that. They've even taken meditators who are having experiences of God consciousness, of cosmic consciousness, of universal unity consciousness. And they found certain patterns, sometimes certain spots in the brain that light up when people have these experiences. They actually some of them have actually called it the God spot, which some laboratory wags have called the G spot. But the point is, there's reality to both of those. And surely when you have a satori in your mind, in your upper left quadrant, it's going to cause a change in brain physiology. the God spot's going to light up or whatever. But these two aren't the same thing at all. They don't even look alike. I mean, your brain, if a surgeon cuts it open and pulls it out, your brain looks like a crumpled grapefruit. And that's it. Your mind doesn't look like a crumpled grapefruit at all. It looks like this space with images and all sorts of ideas and stuff floating through it, and emotional waves and visions and all of that. And speaking about the person who has the Satori experience, what this person is experiencing is a oneness with the ground of all being, a ground of every single thing and event that exists. And if the G spot lights up in the brain, that's the size of a walnut. These are two completely different sizes. Surely oneness with the universe is a little bit bigger than a walnut. So they, just by leaving out first and third, and just even selecting just those two, are a bit ridiculous, because there's also the lower left quadrant, which is a second person. It's the intersubjective I-you reaction. That's what culture is. No major school of consciousness studies brings in that quadrant. And then according to whether you include whole systems theory approaches or not, then some of them will even leave out the lower left quadrant. And clearly all four quadrants light up simultaneously and together, and it's the four of them interacting that produces what we call consciousness. So here again, when we don't include all of the quadrants, what we're doing, whether it's transgenderism or trying to get waking up together with growing up, whenever we don't include all the quadrants, we're leaving something out. We're not showing up for reality. And that is a disaster. So all five of these are important. We've seen that you can get a wholeness in any one of them, and it won't tell you anything about the wholenesses in the others. And that's where integral comes in, by bringing them all together and saying, look, we want to be holistic, right? We want to include as much as we can of the human condition. Well, here are five areas that are worth looking at. Now, you might think some of them are more important than others, and that's fine. But this is at least a list of five probable areas that we all need to work on if we're going to become truly holistic and truly whole. So I'll stop there. Sorry.
Ken, I love the architecture of your mind, my friend. It's stupendous how you hold all these stages and lines and quadrants and so forth all together in a synthetic integral whole is really an amazing thing to bear witness to. So I want to thank you for it. And just as we close here, want to just return to the initial question of, I mean, if you have to provide an analysis of the current world situation from what you just laid out,
right?
Where's the stuckness in the culture that inhibits our leaders from making the critically important decisions? And well, let's do there. And then I want to, the final question is, out of all that you've talked to us about, given the urgency of the global situation, you know, what counsel would you give for us? What pointers should we be considering as we navigate through an increasingly hyper complex reality, because
Right.
we ain't in Kansas anymore.
Right.
And if what code red means is that our human institutions of governance and technology can no longer ensure basic stability in the face of rising ecological and climate turbulence, we have to kind of understand that at a certain level of depth in order to be able to navigate and not only survive the escalating turbulence, but to somehow thrive. I mean, I just love to have your comment on the kind of the current challenges of the world situation in light of what you said.
First of all, let's look at the section on growing up, because one of the most important things is that our leaders will follow where the bulk of the democratic people want to go. And part of the reason that we don't have more sophisticated understanding of the global warming issue among a lot of people, and these people are the ones that eventually affect our leaders. You know that if tomorrow a poll was taken and 95% of Americans wanted to take swift action on the climate crisis, that our leaders would hear it because they want to get reelected. Now the problem then is, okay, where are most people located in the growing up process? And they better be at least a world-centric level, which understands global realities. If they're not at a world-centric level, they're going to think global warming is a joke. It's not real. I don't have to worry about it. It's because they don't cognize, they can't see a global reality. It doesn't fit into the structures that they have operating their brains. So the question is, how many people are not at least a modern or postmodern level? And you can, depending on which multiple intelligence you test, you can get different responses. I'm going to use the one from Robert Keegan in his book called In Over Our Head. And his point is that the artifactual nature of our world has grown so globalized that if people don't get up to a global world-centric level themselves, they don't have the tools to operate satisfactorily at a modern global level of development. And he shockingly says 3 out of 5 Americans don't make it to the modern global rational level. That doesn't mean that they can't think rationally every now and then. It means their center of gravity, they're still identified with an ethnocentric, mythic, us versus them, non-global structure. And so until we get them up at least to the rational, world-centric, modern level of development, then we're never going to get more than 60%, 3 out of 5, of our people who can even start to understand the true nature of the global crisis. And if they're not seeing it, we're getting this lackluster response that affects our leaders. You've seen polls going back 10 years, and they've just started to shift upwards a little bit in the last 2 or 3 years, but where people rank global warming as a problem. And the vast majority of them didn't rate it a problem of even in the top 10. Now I think it's like at number 3 or number 4 and is starting to move up. But that's got to be a major point that we look at. And the cure for that is, of course, education. But to change education, we do have to make changes in education. Since it only educates now for cognitive and verbal intelligence, those are only 2 lines pulling to get us up through the ethnocentric to the world-centric to the postmodern. And so we're not going to get much help from colleges until there's a little revamp in the way colleges look at what they're educating. Now, the last point, so that's very important. And when we can move, instead of 60% of Americans not making it up to modern, we get just 60% of them that are. Democracy has always been said that it's the bet that half the people are right at least half of the time. So if we can just get that 60% up to modern, by the way, this has a lot of integrally related effects. For example, you want to get rid of racism, you better get people out of ethnocentric, or it's not going to happen. So if we can get them up to world-centric or higher, then that's going to create a feedback loop into our leaders. At the same time, I do want to throw out a little bit of a hint to not everybody is doing this for sure, and not everybody makes this mistake when they interpret it, but we do want the real science as far as we can get it. And that is where, at least in some people, in some ways, the science tends to get a little bit overblown. And that's not to say I'm a climate denier or anything like that. I just explained how I clearly think we are, and what one of the major things that we're going to have to do about it. If we're going to take care of a global crisis, we're going to have to get people up to a global stage of development. It's that simple. That's not hard to figure out. At the same time, to the extent that science gets distorted, that's going to leave all those holes for the people who are climate deniers, or at least want to say, oh, it's not nearly as bad. And so being not nearly as bad, we can just forget it. But if we look for science, of course, the first thing I have to say is, okay, who do we want to take as authorities on science? The authority that I'm willing to use, just as an example, is the IPCC. Now, you've heard of that, right? It's the United Nations.
Yeah, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And so it's the one that has put together the Paris Accords and all of that. So you know it believes very much in climate change, and it wants very much that we all get engaged in doing something about it. But if you read, in a sense, it's the fine print in their huge volume, where all of the major scientists in the world come together and give their opinion on what's happening. The IPCC, the most recent estimate on where we're going with global climate, is that by the year 2075, handling global crisis will acquire about 2.75% of the world's national product. Now, certainly if you look at it, 2.5% of GDP is not a horrible, it's not death of all human beings, for one thing. And I think that you do have to be careful where you get to that degree of extremism. A recent poll taken worldwide showed that 45%, almost half of humanity, thinks that the global warming crisis is going to kill all of humanity. Kill all of humanity. 50% of the world population believes that. That's a little bit much. Now, we can still see enormous problems coming, and the IPCC certainly still does. But we have to, again, hold that in an integral view where we're checking in with all the quadrants, making sure we're getting data from all of them. And so in this case, I think we have a real problem. And the real problem is, as Robert Keegan would put it, we're in over our heads.
I think that's the real point. I think Keegan called it, Ken, we're all in over our heads. And we're not sophisticated enough in our integral understanding of the world to even to understand that we need to upgrade our growth and development, particularly in our national leadership, that tends to reduce itself to the lowest common denominator. So as the crises get worse, you get someone like Trump coming in and accentuating the very aspects of the culture that need to be upgraded and reinforcing them to make them more fanatical, which means that you can't deal with the problems, whether it's climate change or racism. There's more racism now in America than ever before because that meme has been so dramatically reinforced in the culture.
Right. And with the culture that, again, following Keegan's numbers, 3 out of 5 of them
are very susceptible to that
position where they can see that racism is bad.
Yeah.
And 3 out of 5 is not a happy number for a democracy.
No.
50, 5 out of 5, but no, it's 3 out of 6. I mean, 3 out of 5, which is 60%.
Yeah. Well, that leads us, to the importance of education and the importance of somehow working in the collective, as complicated as that is, with an integral framework. And I can tell you, having been involved with Ubiquity, just how challenging it is to bring the integral framework into the mainstream, but how the challenges make it even more imperative. So as we bring this to a close, just like to have you say any final words of inspiration to us, as we know we're up over our heads.
Right.
What's the way forward? What's some wise counsel, Dr. Wilber?
Well, I think maybe the best, shortest thing I could say is we do have areas of wholeness, and they are the results of the direction that evolution has been going for 14 billion years. But these areas of wholeness, the really important thing I'd like to get across to everybody is that each and every one of you have all 5 of these areas of wholeness operating in you right now.
Yeah.
And if you are willing to spend just a little bit of time to look into it, you can learn what these areas of wholeness are. You can learn how to spot them. As soon as you finish reading the section, you'll know how to spot the wholeness. You'll know where it is. And what it's going to take for us to get over not just the climate crisis, but as I said, racism, sexism, almost any problem you can think of in the culture wars, I can point to some area of wholeness that's being left out. And that's the crime, because we all have these wholenesses in us. We are extraordinarily developed unity in diversity creatures. And given that we all have these types of wholeness, we can all awaken them in ourselves, then we have something we can contribute just in interacting with other people at that point, because we'll be interacting with them on a holistic, truly whole fashion. And that in itself will make a difference. Then, of course, as ubiquity continues to help people to wake up and grow up and open it up, this will start select areas of wholeness, not just one or two individuals, but actual sections of wholeness. And they will speak to their representatives, and they will start insisting that stuff get done. And as soon as we hit that tip from 60% out of it to at least just 50% in it, we're going to start to see some differences. And so before 50% of us are killed, I think trying to become a little more whole will be a bit easier.
Thank you, Ken. It comes down to the bottom line, everyone, is to wake up, grow up, clear up, open up, and then show up.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to do collectively so that we could increase, as Ken's just said, this critical mass of people who are going through this process and are aware. So Ken, my good friend, thank you for everything. It's wonderful to see you again. You look healthy. And your new book is Making Room for Everything. Making Room for Everything. So that'll be on the bookshelves soon. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, buddy.
Be well.
Bye-bye.
See you again tomorrow, everyone, for Humanity Rising. And tomorrow we're going to be looking at one of the more troubling aspects of racism, and that's a report a couple of months ago of mass burials of Indigenous children in Canada with some Indigenous people and the legal mind that are going to help us understand that whole very, very sad and tragic phenomenon in Canadian, and I would add American history. And that'll be tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.